Communication styles. Hopefully you have the communication styles document printed in front of you. What I want to do is I want to go over this in a little bit of detail, and I typically don't like to do this because it's pretty self-explanatory, and so you can read this over yourself. But I want to elaborate a little and sort of translate this notion of communication styles into what actually happens at Model United Nations conferences. And so the basic idea here is that we're going to be talking about three different communication styles: a non-assertive style, an assertive style, and an aggressive style. The reality is that people usually don't have one form of communication, one communication style. Oftentimes it'll change depending what circumstance they're in. So somebody might be very assertive, have an assertive style, but if they're surrounded by a group of people, they're superiors, they might adopt a more non-assertive style. Somebody might have an aggressive style, but when they're around other people, they might change it. So we're talking about the style, the communication style that we want all of our delegates to adopt when they're in the Model United Nations conference. And I would say that for my thinking, the assertive style, which is sort of the one that I think is the most effective, is probably best in almost every situation. It may be that there are times when you need to slip into the aggressive style. Maybe be times that it's important to go into the non-assertive style, but the sweet spot is really the assertive style. So I want to go over each one of these categories on the table that you can see in front of you and talk about them. And I'm going to talk about them from the perspective of a faculty advisor and what I'm looking for when I walk into a committee room to see how my delegates are doing. When I walk in and I see students, usually people are clumped in groups and they're discussing their working papers, they're discussing the draft resolutions or something. And oftentimes just the physical location of the delegates can tell me something. Delegates who are standing on the outside, just kind of listening in, not really participating, maybe talking to other delegates who are on the outside of the circle as well. These are people who have adopted a non-assertive style, right? And that's always a bad sign. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to be in the center of a group every single time. But anytime I see somebody consistently on the outside of a group, that's a concern. And the chair, the dais, is going to notice that as well. There are also people who stand towards the center, right, or in the center. And what they do is they allow others to speak, and they let others speak, and then when they're done, they go ahead and speak, and they go ahead and interact in a way that we normally communicate with one another. That's the assertive style. I talk, then you talk, then somebody else talks, and somebody else talks, and everybody's listening, actively listening, and then engaging as well. In the aggressive style, what happens is you'll have one or two delegates, but usually it's one person who tries to do this. They try and take over the whole group. They speak, and if somebody else starts speaking and they get an idea in their head, they'll interrupt and they'll just start speaking over them. Speaking is important, listening is important. And so the middle category, allow others to complete what their thoughts are before you start speaking, is clearly where you want to be. Again, delegates with a non-assertive style are usually more interested in listening than speaking. They oftentimes what I'll hear from delegates is like, oh, I was just listening and taking in information. That may work for a while, but you have to be giving information too. If you're just sitting and taking in information and listening all the time, then you're not really doing what you need to do. On the other hand, people who adopt the aggressive style, they're not really interested in hearing what anybody has to say. They're interested in talking, telling people what they think. So again, the ideal style is the assertive style. You want to be interested in listening, but you also want to be interested in going ahead and sharing your ideas, sharing your thoughts about the topic under consideration. Delegates with a non-assertive style will go ahead and they'll avoid taking strong stands because they really don't want to create a confrontation. They don't like confrontations. They don't like disagreements. And so they go ahead and avoid it. They may say something, and if somebody takes exception to it, then they just step back. People with with an aggressive style, they'll take strong stands, and then if somebody else tries to disagree with them or present an alternative perspective, they essentially try to impose their views on them. They'll interrupt, they'll say, no, you're wrong, they'll discredit them, sometimes they'll even attack them personally. That's also not an acceptable style as well. What you want to do is you want to take strong stands on matters of principle, on things that are important to your country or your character. And you want it to be based on evidence. You want to assert yourself, but you don't want to impose yourself on others. What you want to do is you want to win them over through the strength of your ideas, not because you've overpowered them. Another thing that we look for, and I look for in a group, is when it comes to decision-making time. The people who are sitting on the outside of the group just let other people make the decisions. How are we going to word something? How are we going to phrase this resolution? How are we going to phrase this clause? Should we include that? Should we not include that? And it may be that if there's somebody in the center of the group, they maybe even turn to them and say, what do you think? Right? A non-assertive person will just go ahead and nod their head. Yeah, sounds good to me. They don't really give any input. They just go along with what everybody's doing. An aggressive person, they're going to go ahead and they're just going to reflexively just make decisions without seeking anybody else's opinion. No, don't word it like that. They're going to point to the person typing out the resolution. Don't word it like that. Write it like this, right? We don't want to do that either. You want to go ahead and you want to be willing to make decisions. Leaders need to make decisions, right? But take in input from others. Let other people know that you value their input. So as you're working in a committee, you might have an idea of what you think is right, but it doesn't hurt to stop and go, what do you think? Do you agree with that idea? Do you think we should phrase it differently? And get input from other people. And then it's okay to go ahead and say, well, you know what? How do you guys feel if we go ahead and do this? And go ahead and make your decision, but put it in the form of a question. Right? And that way everybody feels, because everybody goes, yeah, that's fine, let's do that. Then everybody feels a part of the decision, but you get input from them. The next thing has to do, and I'm going to skip over the section on friendships, and talk about eye contact, right? And how we speak. Because again, nonverbal communication is so important when you're dealing with people. We tend to think of the words that we say as being the primary form of communication, but I've heard people say, and I'm not sure I agree with this number, but something like 90% of communication is nonverbal. I don't know if I buy that, but certainly a lot of what we do when we communicate is nonverbal. So when somebody walks into a group or somebody's participating in a group and they're speaking very quietly and they're not making eye contact with anybody, and they're just kind of looking sheepish, for lack of a better way of putting it, that communicates something. It communicates a lack of confidence, right? On the other hand, the flip side of that is there's always that person, and you're going to run into them, and the veterans already know about this, who speak really loudly. They're the ones who, even if you're in another working group, you can hear them talking really loudly. And I have to be honest, there are times when people like this win awards because everybody notices them. Even still, I want you to go ahead and avoid that kind of thing. What you should be doing is use a moderate tone of voice, a tone of voice that's normal for conversations, and go ahead and have regular conversations. There may be times if you're in a noisy room that you have to speak up, you have to go ahead and raise your voice a little, but always have a moderate tone. And always when you're talking to people, look them in the eye. Not creepily, don't stare at them, don't give them the up and down, but look at people in the eye, because it projects confidence. And that's one of the things that you want to do. I'm going to skip down another one to this notion of procrastinating. People who have a non-assertive style just procrastinate. When it comes time to go ahead and make decisions, the clock is ticking. You've got to get your work papers in. You've got to get your draft resolution submitted, amendments, all this stuff. The clock is ticking and things need to get done. Non-assertive people just don't want to make a decision, so they just kind of put things off. If they're asked to do something, they kind of hold off. Aggressive people, right, are willing to just distort, misrepresent the facts, do whatever they need to do to get things done quickly. They try and impose things on other people. They just want to get it done quickly. What somebody adopting an assertive style does is they identify the hurdles involved in decision making, maybe sometimes break up the decisions into different categories, and then resolve them with open dialogue. If, let's say, there's 4 different issues that need to be resolved, somebody with an assertive style might say, hey, I have an idea. How about if you go over and resolve this issue having to do with education or proposal? You guys over here, you go handle the funding issue, and we'll be over here working on the issue in terms of the environment. Divide things up, empower everybody, but move the ball forward. Move the ball forward. One of the things you should always be thinking is, how do I go ahead and help the committee achieve its objectives? That's ultimately the goal in any committee. So you can read the other categories as well and think about them and think about what they mean. And when you read them, it's not just don't just think of them in terms of just sort of generally what communication styles that you should adopt in life, but how specifically are you going to use these ideas in conference? What does it mean for your interactions in your committee? And it might be different. If you're in a crisis committee, it might be different, and your strategy might be a little bit different than if you're in a GA. But generally speaking, the sweet spot is the assertive style, not aggressive, assertive. And that concludes this video.